Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District of Columbia to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is, and certainly appears to be, a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Yes. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. No. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. No. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. No. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. No. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran voted in the negative. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla? Aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President, very happily, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.